Are you coming with us?
So God of War Ragnarok is finally upon us, the second and final installment of Dad and Boy's journey through the Norse mythology, and Ragnarok has some pretty big shoes to fill. 2018's God of War I think is widely regarded as one of the best games of all time, at least in my opinion, and it is a much needed change of pace for the franchise, not to mention providing some solid parenting advice.
Boy. This way, boy. Come, boy. We do what we please, boy. Ready yourself, boy!
Alright, so this is going to be a pretty spoiler heavy review. I tried to keep it loosey-goosey, but turns out I had too many opinions about this, so here is your spoiler warning.
That was a huge spoiler. Good.
As usual, I'm going to start out by talking about the story, and there's a few things I want to cover here. God of War Ragnarok picks up a few years after the first game. Fimbulwinter has started, symbolising the endeth of days, and that's where the game kicks off. Atreus' moody teen / power trip phase is mostly behind him. He tries to take a more measured approach than in the first game, but does slip back into rash decision making from time to time, which I didn't have a problem with. He's still a young dude, and I wasn't expecting an entirely redefined Atreus in just a few years. Unbeknown to Kratos, Atreus has been researching giant lore, what's happened to Tyr, and how they might prevent Ragnarok from happening, and this leads to the pair travelling across the entirety of the Nine Realms, all of which is in vain when a plot twist is revealed, and we're inevitably forced into the game's namesake. My general take on the story as a whole is that it's suffered with inconsistent pacing. Anyone who has played the game will know what I mean when I say feeding the farm animals in Jotunheim was very tedious and not particularly enjoyable. Compare that with the game's final chapter, which felt very rushed and underwhelming. There's a fucking mint sequence in Vanaheim when you're rescuing Frey, and this is the sort of thing I was hoping for from the finale. Jormungandr crashing through alongside you from one angle and Surtur just whooping ass from another, but unfortunately they were just bystanders and background details rather than prominent figures in the finale. In particular, Jormungandr versus Thor was a bit of a disappointment, it being a blink and you'll miss it moment, which felt like a cheap payoff to a big build up across the two games. Now, I do want to be clear and say for the most part I thoroughly enjoyed the story. I briefly mentioned an awesome stint in Vanaheim, and other noteworthy moments include what is probably the best opening hour of any game this year, possibly ever, a genuinely surprising plot twist, and anyone who comes in here and tells me that they saw that coming, to that I say, bullshit.
We were swearing on the process.
I don't believe you!
And also, there's also some extremely heartfelt moments to this game. Seeing Sindri lose absolutely everything was eye-watering. Fenrir's passing was a little bit close to home. I don't know what it is with games and killing dogs off, but this is just too close for home for me and I can't handle it at the moment. But nonetheless, a very moving moment, and let's be honest, whenever Kratos is on screen, we all watch in awe as Christopher Judge does a f***ing fantastic job bringing the character to life.
No.
In Ragnarok, we get a more in-depth look at other characters. Personally, I found Thor to be one of my favourite side characters, a refreshing spin on Marvel's wisecracking doofus.
You flipped too hard, damn it!
He's brilliantly portrayed as a self-professed failure. He does this thing where he kind of projects that onto himself and his family, and it doesn't help that he's being constantly belittled by his father Odin. And as a result, he's often very cold and just acts like he doesn't give a shit, which for me made him a likeable and relatable part of the story.
You seem like a calm and reasonable person. Are you? No.
Moving on to Freya, I can imagine that her story arc is going to be a little bit Marmite for some people. You're either going to love it or you're going to hate it, but for me, having her tag along for a few chapters was a nice change of pace, both in terms of storytelling and gameplay. We got to see her go from vengeful Valkyrie to a leader in her own right, and I thought that her storyline encapsulated the game's overall message of forgiveness and being better.
I suppose this is the point where I forgive you. Where I kill you.
No.
One character I'd love to hear people's opinions on is Odin. I didn't have any problem with the acting, I thought the acting was great, but for me, his motivations were very weak. He's the primary antagonist and supposed to be an all-knowing god, and his primary motivation was to gain more knowledge.
Wow.
He's got this obsession with a rift which we never get any official explanation for, and he ends up sending you on these lost and found quests, which in the years between games 1 and 2, I'm pretty sure he could have had Thor look into it or do it himself. So this felt a little bit like lazy writing. As I say, I'd love to hear people's opinions on Odin, so let me know down in the comments.
How does peace strike the esteemed
Retired god of war. How about we just don't kill each other?
No.
There's still plenty more story stuff I could cover here, but I don't want to labour it too much. These are just the highlights or my best picks, and I'm conscious that I've barely even mentioned Kratos' character arc, which I think can be boiled down to him trying to escape the monster that the Greek gods created and breaking the cycle of revenge, but with the additional complexity of protecting his son, and this culminates in what I think is one of the most tear-jerking moments in this series so far, when Kratos accepts Atreus is no longer a kid and must forge his own path.
Loki will go. Atreus remains.
Alright, I think I've talked about the story enough. Let's move on and talk about the visuals.
Or the visuals, if you're a dick.
There probably isn't much that I can say about this that hasn't already been said, so I'll try and keep it fairly succinct. The first thing I'd like to talk about is the water. My frigging Norse gods, the water in this game looks so f***ing lush. I just want to take a little dip in there. I'm from the UK where the water looks like this. So the water in God of War, even the murky water of Vanaheim, looks delicious by comparison. And before we move on to talk more generally about the graphics, forgive me one more minor detail. I didn't know I could swoon so much over another man's neck abs. I'm a big weirdo for tiny details like this, and I found Kratos' neck creases weirdly pleasurable to look at. Okay, so speaking more generally, whether you've played this or not, you'll no doubt be aware that we visit all 9 realms in Ragnarok, and visually speaking, they all look bloody fantastic. I love visiting the frozen lake of the Nines for the first time, a vast departure from 2018's God of War. Svartalheim is a highly picturesque location, blue skies, clear water with really cool dwarven influences sprinkled throughout, and it was nice to see the developers add a populated area to the game, something that hasn't been seen yet. Vanaheim was another area that we got to visit, a dense forest area giving off sort of Amazon vibes. And of course, the last place we got to visit is Asgard, and I really liked how they'd taken those old Scandinavian / Viking depictions of these kind of wooden shacks and placed them in Asgard, whilst also managing to make it look ethereal and formidable. It felt like it was a really suitable place for the Norse gods to be chilling out.
I am profoundly unimpressed.
There's obviously more locations we get to visit in Ragnarok, so let me know your favourite one down in the comments. I've just tried to speak to some of the newest ones in the game and some of the ones that I found the most exciting. However, there was one thing that I wanted to point out, and in my opinion, despite the fact that we get to go to all 9 realms and they do all look incredible, they felt more linear, more confined and sort of empty than in 2018's God of War, which by contrast felt like you had a constantly expanding hub which was Midgard, and then the other realms were like smaller hubs or branches off this main area, sort of like this tree that has a constantly expanding trunk and then you can visit all the other branches off it. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's what I'm going with.
What you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard.
And in Ragnarok, once I'd been to an area, I felt like it was done. Unless it was driven by the story, I never felt any desire to go back to other realms, particularly the smaller ones.
Dragon!
Alright, let's move on and talk about the gameplay in Ragnarok, and it retains much of the same stuff from its predecessor with a few much needed changes and enhancements, such as a greater variety of enemies to battle. There is finally a new weapon to get your hands on in the form of the Dropnir Spear, which admittedly you unlock a little bit late in the game for my liking, but it rapidly became my favourite weapon of choice. It was highly pleasurable to fling the spear at an enemy and watch it blow up, and fucking mint to thrust the thing quickly and slickly into a creature's face. It was a much needed addition and very satisfying to use. They've also added the ability to deal more damage if you swap between weapons with the opposite status effect. For example, using the Blades of Chaos on a monster, then switching to the Leviathan Axe deals extra runic damage, but because I'm such a doofus, I didn't even notice this until later on in the game, but it does provide a great opportunity for doing fun combos. Another positive change for me is they've increased Kratos' maneuverability, which was very hard to say, and by that I mean you can leap off ledges to perform a slam attack, you can grapple enemies now, use anchors with the Blades of Chaos to close the gap between enemies, which made the game feel much more fluid when you were in those combat areas. And another area that they have expanded is the shields. You were previously limited to just one, but in Ragnarok, Kratos has access to a wider range. They're now used to reflect a certain way of playing, so you have more defensive shields and shields that are more high risk, high reward for those of you that want to parry and be a bit more aggressive. A small improvement, but I think a welcome one. Whilst we're on about improvements, I am so glad that they finally made Atreus a playable character. I know story-wise it could be a bit slow, but in terms of the gameplay I thought it added much needed variety. He's much more nimble than Kratos, and I thoroughly enjoyed executing a well-timed dodge and then pinging off a few arrows in that kind of slow-mo thing, then following that up by just whacking the hell out of any creature that was in front of me, using the bow as a sword replacement. And for me, I loved the spin on rage mode as well. Being able to change into a wolf or a bear felt really character appropriate in terms of the lore, Loki sort of being a shapeshifter character. I know he might not have been everyone's cup of tea, but for me it was a cool development on the first game.
That is your big special move? Hilarious!
So what about the RPG elements? Well, this hasn't changed much from the previous game. You're still tasked with equipping and upgrading armor that will boost certain traits. There's still a massive skill tree that you have to unlock with the addition of usage bonuses. I think that's probably the right term. Basically, if you repeat a skill several times, you can add a boost for damage, momentum, or stun, which I never really used because I forgot about it. Now, I have two gripes about the gameplay, and the first is continuity from the first game. My immediate reaction when picking up Ragnarok was that I had already gone through all of this in the first game, and I just felt like, what has Kratos been doing this entire time? He's just been sat on his arse and forgot. I thought it would have been nice that if you had a save file from the first game, you could have carried over some elements, perhaps a runic ability or two, some of the skill tree was maybe unlocked, or an armor set which could have given you an early game buff. I don't know if this is just a me thing, but for me getting stripped of everything was just a little bit annoying. And my second gripe with the gameplay is the enemies being absolute bullet sponges, particularly the undead Asgardian enemies. This wouldn't bother me so much, however it didn't exactly make me feel like I was playing as the former God of War. And this issue was only highlighted when playing as Atreus, and as I've said, I did enjoy the combat mix-up, but when playing as Atreus, they just gobbled up hits, and it just didn't feel gratifying. Alright, so bringing this all together, the question I find myself asking, is this better than 2018's God of War game? And the answer in my opinion is not quite, but it comes close. Does it build on the first game? Well, I think it does. There's a more meaty story here, more characters, there's more realms to explore, there's some innovations in the gameplay, we have more variety, and it retains the franchise's unapologetically brutal nature. And I think because of that, I have to slap a label of really mint on this. I wanted to slap fucking mint on there, but for that to happen, it had to be better than the first game, and I don't think it was quite there. By the end of this game, I found myself feeling a bit like this.
It claims that many male drivers face a potential risk because they're overweight. It's claimed that they're more prone to heart attacks and also
Is that it?
Hotwood has more.
Well, I'm bitterly disappointed.
Whereas when I finished God of War 2018, I got to the end and wanted more.
Wow. Let's do that again.
And that's it. That's my thoughts on God of War Ragnarok. I had far more opinions on this than I ever thought I would, so be sure to let me know your thoughts and opinions down in the comment sections below. And if you've got any feedback on the video in general, I'd love to hear it. This is only my third video on YouTube, and I'm always trying to improve, so feel free to drop any constructive criticism down there in the comments as well. I would really appreciate it. Lastly, I'm gonna be that guy and ask, if you enjoyed the video, please do drop a like and subscribe. And if you didn't enjoy the video, thanks for watching the whole thing anyway. Whatever the case might be, I will see you in the next one.
You put him last, even in death. The fuck you say? Modi sought us in fear of you. He died of the wounds you gave him. Oh, we got a model father